So on today's show, we have Steve Schwartz. We're doing a little bit different show today. We actually have video as well as audio. Steve runs 3 podcasts, if I'm not mistaken, right? You have 3 of them now?
2 currently, LSAT Pros and LSAT Unplugged.
2 currently.
But I also have the YouTube.
And the YouTube, yes. So Steve helps people who want to go to law school and take the LSAT. And I thought it would be interesting for our listeners to learn a little bit about what it takes to become a lawyer. And a lot of people don't understand or don't know the process. One of the first things they have to do is take a test called the LSAT, which is a test I hated. And I'm sure all the other people who study for it don't like it. So without me taking up more time, I'm going to let Steve talk about the LSAT and what it is and how you can prepare for it. It's all yours, Steve.
Yeah, great to connect with you today, Arash. Thanks for having me on your show. I'm happy to share my insights about the LSAT and what it takes to go to law school. So the LSAT, a lot of people do hate it. Myself included, I hated it at first, although I gradually came to love it. The LSAT's weird because it tests something that you don't learn in college, you don't learn it in high school, you don't learn it in everyday life. It's a skill of reasoning ability, showing how you can think more critically and analytically, and then make deductions or inferences between different things. And the reason this matters is that law school is testing similar skills, although you're applying them to the real world rather than to arbitrary made-up examples.
Right. I remember one of the test questions. I don't remember if it was a practice one or a real one. Talking about some monkeys sitting on a wall in different colored jumpsuits, and they did different things. I don't remember, but I was studying for it, and I'm thinking, what the hell does this have to do with law school?
Oh, it's crazy, especially the logic games section, these puzzles. They seem to have no relationship at all to reality. It's like 7 different people, like Anne, Barney, Camille, etc., like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way down the alphabet, and you have to manipulate them in different ways. And it's something that nobody would ever have exposure to unless you'd gone to like a nerdy math camp or something like that, which of course most pre-law students did not.
For people who are not familiar, there's 3 different categories on the LSAT, correct?
Yeah, there's 3 different sections types. There's logic games, there's logical reasoning, and there's reading comprehension. And reading comprehension is more familiar. It looks a little bit more similar to the SAT. But logic games in particular, they're these mathematical style puzzles where you have to draw diagrams and symbols and make notations. And it's really hard if you haven't done it before. So most people looking at the LSAT, they just totally bomb that section at first. But you can learn it with time. There is a method to the madness.
Right. And saying that, what method do you think, or how do you, I don't even know how to ask the question, where do you start? What is the first thing besides registering for the LSAT? You registered, you want to go to law school, you know you have to take this test, and now the test, test is coming up. How do I start, Steve? What do I do?
Great question. So first thing is you can go on LSAT's website. They publish one exam for free. It's the June 2007 LSAT. You can download it as a PDF. And you could do a few questions, do a few sections, do the whole exam if you want. The one thing I would not do is do the full exam under timed conditions at first as a diagnostic, because it'll tell you what you already know, which is that you don't know anything yet and you haven't learned the LSAT. So results on those are often really discouraging. And then people say, oh my God, I need to get like $1,000 course or something. If you do poorly, it doesn't mean anything. It means you just have to learn the basics. And so from there, you could start with logic games. I'd recommend. There's a ton of free resources out there on YouTube, on my website, where you can learn the foundation first. You build your skills in each logic game type, then you move on to logical reasoning, which are short, bite-sized arguments, and finally reading comprehension. But I've laid out a variety of study plans. You can use others too, but basically my strategy is learn each section one by one, scaffolding or building your understanding as you go, and then finally move on to the timed component.
Now, Steve, you mentioned there's all these resources out there, and one of them is your website. What is your website?
Great question. Thanks for asking. I should mention my website is the LSAT Blog. I also have, of course, my podcast as well, but the blog is really the centerpiece of all my free resources. I have 1,000 articles on every aspect of LSAT prep, including the basics of the different sections, as well as preparing for test day itself. I also have some low-cost books and guides and courses as well.
Let me ask you this. What made you start the website and the podcast. Why? Because when I was done taking the LSAT, I didn't want to have anything to do with it again. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to talk about it. You have immersed yourself in it. What made you do that?
It's a great question. I definitely never saw myself doing this, especially when I first looked at logic games and totally bombed them. I was a poli-sci major, so this was not my natural next step, was to become like a standardized test person. But I had been tutoring some other subjects like the SAT, the ACT, et cetera. And then I considered law school because I was a poli-sci major. I was interested in politics and whatnot. And I gradually over time became obsessed with the LSAT. I just really wanted to master it because I wanted to go to a top law school. And so very slowly over the course of a year, I brought my scores from the mid 150s or low 150s, which is kind of like the average score, all the way up to a 175, which is a 99th percentile score. And through that grueling process, I did every exam ever released. I used every LSAT book I could find. And I slowly managed to change my way of thinking to become more analytical, more critical, more skeptical, and take that mindset. And once I did that, I found I was in a position that few people are, which is really having a deep understanding of the LSAT. And I'm in New York. There's a lot of people here who want to go to top law schools. There's a big market for standardized testing. And so I figured, well, I've tutored other things. I know the LSAT. I could tutor this also. And over time, I found that I was really good at it and I enjoyed it. And I figured, you know what? This is becoming something. Why not delay law school for a bit? And then I started the website to share my knowledge and make some blog posts and articles to reach people who maybe couldn't afford tutoring or maybe reach a wider audience. And it just kind of built from there. And now with the internet growing along the way with, you know, YouTube and podcasts and all these other things as well, it's like blogs, it's like I can just build more and more and put it out for free. And like you're doing with your podcast as well, Arash, like you're reaching a much larger audience than you ever would have expected, I imagine, as well.
Right. Let me ask you this. So you said you went from an average score to like a 175, which is the 99th percentile. How many tests, practice tests, did you take to get that?
I must have done a couple dozen at least. I did probably 40 or 50 at that point.
Wow. You're a brave man. Brave man. But
or just a combination of dumb and hardworking. I don't know, but it is a bit of a slog. You know, it's a lot of work.
Right. I have the bad habit of, if I don't have an interest in something, I procrastinate or I don't do it. So in order for me to sit there and dedicate myself to the test like LSAT, I would have to be so disciplined. And I envy you for doing that. That's amazing. So, all right. So I registered for the LSAT. I went on your website. I got the free sample test from the LSAT website, and I'm studying. How do I approach to studying? What do I do? Do I focus on a certain area? Like, do I do the logics first, or do I jump around? What do I do?
Great question. I typically recommend doing logic games first, because they are the most intimidating section at first. These are those puzzles I mentioned, but they are the most learnable and the most perfectible, actually. So people are really scared of them. They don't want to deal with them. They feel like it's going to bomb their score, but they are the most learnable, and you can break them down by game type. Like there are games that involve you putting things in order. We call those ordering games. There are games that involve putting things in groups, grouping games. And so you do them in order from easier games to harder games, building your understanding. So let's say you want to learn ordering games. I have categorizations. You can do a bunch of ordering games in a row to really focus on and solidify those skills for those game types. And then you can move on to grouping games, do the same thing. Then you could do games that involve combinations of elements of both. So you really build your understanding bit by bit, easier to harder, working by game type. And like I said, I did 40, 50 exams. It can be intimidating at first, but once you get into it, it becomes this addiction almost, where it's like Pokemon, you got to catch them all. Like the exams, there are people who want to do every exam. And now, back when I was studying, there were like 40 exams. Now there's nearly 100. And so I'm not saying you have to do all 100 exams. You could focus on the most recent 20 or 30 and just focus on doing games in those exams by type, then logical reasoning questions in those exams by type. But you structure it, you break it down. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that's what my study plans do. They help you build the foundation first with each game type, each section type, each question type, so that you're not facing yourself with the hardest stuff first, because that'll only discourage you. Rather, you want to build your confidence taking the lowest hanging fruit first.
Right. So Steve, how many times is LSAT given in a year?
That's actually a great question. It's changing. For my entire career, it was given 4 times a year. But now in recent years, maybe due to in part competition from the GRE, they're offering it more frequently. So now the LSAT, it's not quite clear yet, but it's going to be offered as many as 9 or 10 times per year. So
Wow.
there's always another opportunity to take it. Let's say you take it in March, it doesn't go well. June's only 2 months away. If not that, July. So there are always more chances to take it. If you're not ready, you can always postpone, and you always have chances to retake. So it's never over. You don't have to worry or put too much stress on one single exam date.
So your answer brings more questions to my mind. How long does it take for a test taker to find the results?
LSAC takes about 3 weeks to come back with your score. They do all kinds of complicated statistical analysis to make sure the exam was valid and all the questions were solid. So there is unfortunately a bit of a wait, but if let's say you're taking it in the fall and you want to apply ASAP, you can work on your application during that time. So 3-week delay, you work on your personal statement, your letters of rec, any addenda, things of that nature. So you can use the time productively, and you can also relax because you've earned it.
Okay. And then people talk about canceling their score. What is canceling your score, and do you recommend it, or how do you do it?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, of course. So canceling your score is something people do when they don't want to have a bad result on their record. Let's say you took the LSAT, didn't go as well as it could have. You feel like you have a score that you wouldn't be happy with. You could cancel it, and then law schools will never see the score. The downside is that you'll never see it either, and there's no backsies on that. So once you've canceled it, it's done. You could get a 170, but feel like it went poorly. You cancel it, well, you'll never know what you could have gotten. And in the past, like decades ago, you could have canceled, and that would have been a wise choice because law schools were averaging multiple scores.
Right.
That has changed. Even as far back as 2006, the American Bar Association changed its policy so that law schools only report the highest score of their matriculating students. So you took it, let's say you took it cold and got a 150, you take it again and get a 170. That is not averaged to a 160. 170 is what counts, meaning that there is very little reason to ever cancel your score because no matter what, they're only taking the highest. And people are often not great judges of how it went, especially with all the stress and adrenaline of the test day. You could feel like you bombed it when in reality you did perfectly fine. And even if you didn't do as well as you thought you did, again, they're not averaging the score. So I really don't recommend canceling. And if you are thinking about it, you do have about, I think it's 5 or 6 calendar days from the test administration to decide. So don't ever cancel on the day of or while you're still in the test center. Give yourself a day or two to cool off a bit and then reconsider. But there's really no reason to cancel unless something went terribly wrong for certain.
I learned something new today. When I took the LSAT, they average your score. So canceling was one of these things that, oh, do I cancel? Well, I think I did really bad. They're going to average my score. So now it completely makes sense. If they're not averaging your score, why cancel it? You get to see what you did, and you can either surprise yourself or learn from it. So that's good to know. Learn something new today. All right. So how long do you think I need, or not me, but the person who wants to take the LSAT, how long do you think they need to actually study for the LSAT? So if I want to take the LSAT, do I register 2 months before, 3 months before? What do you recommend?
Yeah, it brings to mind a couple of things. One of them is that if you're thinking of taking the LSAT, you should register as soon as possible because they don't make enough test centers available at the outset for each registration period. And so let's say you're located in central LA or Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan or something. Those are the most conveniently located test centers. They're going to get booked up first. And you don't want to have to go all the way out to the boonies for your test when you might have to travel for a few hours, get stuck in traffic, or maybe some people even get a hotel room the night before. So register early to get the most convenient test center. When should you register? ASAP. Let's say you're taking it in March or June, still register now as soon as you know you might be even think of taking it. How long you should study for? I'd recommend a minimum of 3 months because it takes time. The LSAT's like learning a foreign language, especially the game section. But not only are you learning the skills and question types, you're also learning how to do it efficiently and in the time allotted. And there is not nearly enough time allotted for each test section. So pacing and endurance are big parts of prep as well. So 3 months is the minimum. I would actually recommend closer to 5 or 6 months if possible, because it's worth it. The LSAT is the biggest factor in your law school admissions. Your GPA is already set in stone, and it's typically the result of 4 years. It's the culmination of your entire undergrad. The LSAT is one day, but you get more bang for your buck with all the LSAT studying you do over a period of 3 to 6 months than you do spending 4 years with all the different classes you're taking. So I'd recommend really, if possible, devoting that time, using summer break if you're still in college, using winter break, but budgeting more time than you think you'll need, and really having a regimented study plan where you're studying at least 10 to 15 hours per week would be ideal.
Okay, that was going to be my next question, but you sort of answered it. Do I study every day? Do I study just 5 days a week, 8 hours a day? How do I do it? But then you answered my question. I remember studying for the bar. I found it that if I treated it like a job, I went in, studied 4 hours, took a break, lunch break, studied 4 more hours, and I did that, then I was consistent enough where I could take the test. And the LSAT, is that something you recommend, or how do you recommend people do it? Because I know scientific studies have shown that your brain cannot absorb more than an hour worth of information. So for people who cram, is it worth it? Should they do it in a different style? What do you recommend?
Yes, study schedules and budgeting time for studying, that's been definitely one of my focuses over the past several years, because we have to contend with reality. It's not just enough to learn the exam content. It's also, when are you going to learn the exam content? Especially, I work with a lot of students who are paralegals working long hours, or they're in school full time, or they're working. And it's hard when you have other obligations. So I recommend definitely blocking out time in your schedule. I'd recommend, let's say you're studying, if you're fortunate enough to study full time, that's really amazing. If you have parents supporting you or a significant other, then you could study, block off 3 hours in the morning, have a break for lunch, block off another 3 hours in the afternoon, and have that be it with frequent breaks throughout. But if you're in school or you're working, then you really have to squeeze in that time wherever possible. So let's say you work at a law firm, you're a paralegal, get to work an hour or two early while it's quiet. Find a conference room or at your desk, do a few hours before everyone else comes in, carve out time during lunch. If you can work from your desk during the workday, maybe read some articles on my website or watch some YouTube videos on my channel just to get some quick tips where you can. And then after work, when you get out 5, 6 o'clock, stay at work or find a coffee shop nearby to study. Because once you get home, there's all these distractions of life, your family, Netflix, relaxing, and you're tired. It's understandable. So while you're still in work mode and still in your work outfit and in that study mode of focus, that's where you want to find your time. I have, again, a variety of study plans for all different periods from 1 month all the way up to 7 months of studying, so that you know exactly what to do every single day. And I've also carved out day-by-day plans even within a day, like what I described during lunch, before work, after work, to squeeze in that time.
And those plans are available on your website, right?
They are. I have free week-by-week plans, and I also have premium day-by-day plans where I really get hyper-specific, not only into how to spend your time, but also what to do, which prep tests or practice tests to complete, which books to use, with even the page numbers and citations as well.
What was the name of your website again?
It's the LSAT Blog. I also have the LSAT Blog YouTube and LSAT Unplugged YouTube, and the podcast as well.
We're going to make sure we include the links to your website and your podcast in the description of this episode when we air it. Make sure everybody has all the information they need. Now, there was a rumor going around some years ago that they're going to get rid of the LSAT. Obviously, they haven't. But did you hear that rumor, or do you think it's ever going to happen?
Yeah, that's something that comes up every now and then. It's the idea, not necessarily to get rid of the LSAT altogether, but to get rid of the requirement that law schools use the LSAT as a criteria for admissions. And it's interesting because the American Bar Association says that law schools must use a valid and reliable admission test. But who defines what is valid and what is reliable? This is where the GRE has come in with ETS as a competitor exam, because the GRE is computerized already. It's offered every weekday, but it hasn't really been shown, at least in my opinion, to be as reliable an indicator of first-year law school grades the way the LSAT is. The LSAT has a long history going back to 1948, being used as an admission test, and since 1991, it's been offered in its current format. So law school, the American Bar Association has not really gotten rid of it yet, it's still kind of in this murky gray area as to whether the GRE is considered valid and reliable, but law schools are still a lot of law schools are starting to use it as a backdoor for STEM applicants and those who may not have taken the LSAT. But the LSAT is, as far as I can tell, it's here to stay, at least as the primary exam, even if it's not the only exam that's used.
Now, the GRE, that's for graduate school. How similar and how different is that from the LSAT?
It's completely different. It's kind of like a more difficult version of the SAT in some ways. There's a lot of vocabulary on it. There's math on it as well. But I think law schools are really using it because they're struggling with the decrease in recent years of the number of law school applicants. And so they want a way to get more people in the door who may not have even been considering law school. And while that's fine for Harvard Law or the top 14, because anyone who they expect is going to be capable no matter what, it's really more of an issue for the lower tier law schools where they're admitting people who may not really have the abilities or skills to do well in law school or to pass the bar exam in the end. So I would caution anyone considering law school, and this might sound a little bit harsh, but if you can't get a good LSAT score, that might be an indication that law school is not right for you. I wouldn't want someone to go to law school and then not be able to pass the bar or even pass 1L a year, and then they're forking out tens of thousands of dollars in scholarship money and not be able to, tens of thousands of dollars in tuition money, and then not be able to pay it back later.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people, there is some law schools that actually don't require you to take the LSAT, but then those law schools, we had a saying, if you have a heartbeat in a checkbook, they'll let you in, but it doesn't mean that you're going to pass the bar. It doesn't mean you're even going to finish the law school. So Steve, what other tips do you have for people who are considering going to law school and taking the LSAT? Some tips that we haven't discussed or we haven't come across yet.
One thing I would emphasize is starting early, because it is a big journey, it is a big slog. The LSAT is maybe harder than some people might think about it at first glance. So definitely invest the time and start now just to get some exposure. And the other thing I would say is apply early if you can. We're talking now in February. Let's say someone is listening to this in March or April or May or June. They should try to apply at the beginning of the cycle, because that's when law schools have the most scholarship money available to give out. If you're applying at the end of the cycle, they've already kind of emptied their coffers a bit. They may not be as generous. But if you're applying at the beginning, you have more money available to you, and you also have more chances to retake if you need to. A lot of people end up postponing or retaking the LSAT more than they would have thought. I talked to a lot of people who are taking it 3, 4, 5 times, and nobody ever thinks that'll be them at the start, but things can go wrong or work gets busy and then you need to delay a bit. So it's better to start this process earlier if you can. The other thing I should mention is people should really make sure to use real LSAT exams. There's a lot of books out there that use fake simulated questions that are not realistic and even contain mistakes sometimes. So make sure you're using the actual LSAT prep tests.
Those are good tips. One of the things that I realize a lot of people don't have in mind is the scholarship money that you mentioned. People don't think about that when they're taking the LSAT or they're getting ready to go to law school. So that's a good point. This was very informative. It was kind of haunting because you brought back LSAT memories, but I'm sure all the other listeners appreciate everything. I actually learned a lot. Now that I know that I don't have to take the LSAT, this is actually an enjoyable conversation. I really liked it. The fact that you have all these things out there for the listeners, for the people who want to take the LSAT, and you're actually available to them is great. When I was taking the LSAT, there was no YouTube, and we couldn't download PDFs of stuff. We had to actually take a class and things like that. So the resources are out there. You and your website are one of the great resources out there. I appreciate you for being on the show. I'm hoping to have you back on. And for all the people out there, please subscribe to his podcast. Go look at his website. Very informative if you want to take the LSAT. Steve, thank you. And I hope I will speak to you again.
Thanks for having me on. It was a real pleasure.